Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. After 68 years, the two Koreas are on the verge of signing a peace treaty. A Donald Trump-Kim Jong-un summit is in the works. Is peace coming to the Korean peninsula? Well, it's possible. The foreign policy blob and the corporatist media are less enthusiastic. After all, conflict is their business model. Cross-talking the Korean Peninsula, I'm joined by my guest, Saurabh Gupta in Washington. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Also in Washington, we have John Merrill. He is former chief of the Northeast Asia Division of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. State Department, as well as author of Korea, The Peninsular Origins of the War. And in New York, we cross to Daniel Lazar. He is an author and freelance journalist who writes frequently about the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. Constitution. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. So, Rep, let me go to you first in Washington. If you look at the mainstream media, and particularly the cable stations, all the focus on the Korean Peninsula is directed towards this summit that Trump may have with the North Korean leader. But really, I think it's what's more important is happening this week, and it's the two Koreas coming together. How does this change the situation on the peninsula if North Korea and South Korea can find some kind of meaningful, and let me stress, meaningful rapprochement? Go ahead in Washington.
Let me, in response to your question, lay it out right away that the real credit for the situation, the opportunity that we have today is because of President Moon Jae-in in South Korea. You know, if we had the same old conservative South Korean government in place today, what would have happened is Kim Jong-un would have gone through with his condensed testing schedule. And then after that, he would have gone straight into his bunker, emerging from time to time with grave threats and snarly, gnarly threats to blow everything up. The fact of the matter is that Moon Jae-in is the person who has been able to tease Kim Jong-un out into the sunshine and has opened and shown him a pathway to global integration and as well as North-South reconciliation. Moon Jae-in, the South Korean progressive government, has led this process of reconciliation, which has dramatically altered the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, the Olympics also have helped. And therefore, it is North and South, the extent that they lead the process, that they will drag the other parties along, including the United States. So the real credit lies with the peninsula parties. Okay,
John, let me go to you more or less the same question here, because the dynamic changes considerably. If there is a peace between the two Koreas after 68 years, they start coming to some kind of defense and security measures that both can accept. Then regime change, as it were, that we hear so many people talking about in the Washington foreign policy blob, that kind of is taken off the table because that would not be in South Korea's interest. Go ahead, John, in Washington.
Right, Peter. Well, I think you overstated it a little bit. I do give President Moon a lot of credit. But I think the main credit, and I never thought I would say this, probably belongs to Donald Trump.
I knew you were going to say that.
This is the man who said he wanted nothing more than to sit down and have a hamburger with Kim Jong-un, and it looks like he's going to get his chance. Right now, they're apparently still CIA people, liaison people behind in Pyongyang, at least according to the South Korean media. And people are hard at work. And Mr. Pompeo is the guy that's been running this, formerly from his post as CIA director, but hopefully in a few days as Secretary of State. So I think I would agree that President Moon deserves a lot of credit. And certainly with a progressive government, a lot of things are possible that weren't under past conservative regimes. But I think we have to give President Trump his due as well.
Sure.
And I just hope things go okay. It's a topsy-turvy world right now.
Exactly. And you know, and I'm very happy that this process is going on. Let me go to Daniel. I don't care who gets the credit. I think that is really low on the hierarchy of importance here. Getting peace on that peninsula where you have the most heavily armed border in the world after 68 years. The considerable American military presence is there. And the Chinese have come in ways that I think we'll find out in the future that were very constructive here. It's the result that counts, most importantly. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, let me speak up for Kim Jong-un, who I think has played his cards extremely well. This is not a political endorsement of him by any means, but he is a very smart player.
Yep.
And he has done a very good job. He's, he kind of seized control of the opening, seized the opening that Trump accorded him, and has really run with it. And I think it's a pretty impressive performance.
Okay, let's go back to Washington. I think what's really important here, I mean, it's good to get down to really the details here because we have a denuclearized South Korea. I'm sorry, Korean Peninsula. That means north and south. So that means that American nukes would not be allowed there. I mean, this is the kind of opening that I think the North Korean leader was looking for. He's looking for a grand bargain. And you know what, folks? He's been asking for a grand bargain for a while. And I think he had to go through all of the theatrics of the missiles and the launches and, you know, all of the heated rhetoric back and forth. This was the opening that he was looking for, and it was a South Korean leader that opened the door, and we got a nod from Donald Trump. I mean, we'll find out where it goes. So, you know, it really gets down to the details of what that means, because we know all along North Korea wants security guarantees. Maybe Russia and China can be guarantors of that. Go ahead, Sorup in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely correct on that. I mean, the real devil is in the details in terms of how do you go about staging nuclearization, in terms of how that process works out, the mechanics of that process. But you're absolutely correct on that point with regard to denuclearization, that it is not just a North Korean affair. It needs to be a peninsular affair. Let me throw out a useful principle which might be useful out here, both in terms of denuclearization as well as in reduction of conventional forces on the peninsula and in terms of the hostilities that are there. In terms of denuclearization, we're talking, of course, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. They can have a civil nuclear program, which will be very intrusively watched over by the IAEA, full scope safeguards, etc., etc. But what that means for South Korea is that, of course, they have their very extensive civil nuclear program, but there will be no strategic forces on their territory, and there won't even be an extended deterrent to South Korea provided by the U.S. so long as there is complete denuclearization of the North. Now, the parallel fact which North and South Korea frankly need to work out, because denuclearization is essentially a topic of discussion between North Korea and the United States. With regard to conventional forces, what the disposition at the end of the day needs to be that the peninsula is kind of insulated from larger geopolitics of Northeast Asia. South Korea has already shown that it is not terribly interested in getting into things like a regional ballistic missile shield. It's not interested in a trilateral alliance.
We're going to find out just how far the Pentagon wants to go along with it. Sean, let me go to you, because if you look at the mainstream media and the punditry that we were bombarded with all of the time, the mainstream media is really not on board here. Is it just because they don't want to see Trump succeed at anything, or in the military-industrial complex? I mean, South Korea and that region of the world is a nice trough for arms, and you know, the U.S. has a vast military establishment there that needs to be paid for. I mean, is it a combination of these things here? Go ahead, John, in Washington.
Well, you know, Peter, I don't know. That's kind of hard to say. What I will say is this: I think what has happened is that we have now gotten a de facto freeze for freeze. This was the proposal that was made by Moscow and Beijing years ago, and I wrote an op-ed on this subject about a year and a half ago, and I got excoriated for saying that. But this is what is now de facto in place, and so this is a big deal.
It is a big deal.
You know, the U.S. military exercises this year, the joint U.S.-ROK exercises, are a shadow of their former self. Last year we had 3 aircraft carrier battle groups participating. This year it's one small aircraft. It's really an assault ship with short takeoff and landing F-35s. So it's a huge deal. Now, there are huge military asymmetries on the peninsula, which are going to be astronomically difficult to resolve. So we may get a start in these discussions. When the 2 Korean leaders meet, they may, in a few days, they may even declare an end to the Korean War, at least hostilities. But it's going to take a lot of tough slogging to work through some of these details, and particularly to put in place the security guarantees, which I think the North Koreans are going to insist on to go forward.
Daniel, let me go to you. I mean, security guarantees, that's what it's always been about. And I'm glad that John mentioned the freeze for freeze, because that's been around for a while. Nobody in the mainstream media says that, where that idea comes from. But I can tell you, if you go to last year during the Security Council, you could see the Russian and the Chinese ambassador at length go through that, process here. Daniel, before we go to the break, go ahead in New York.
Well, I just want to remind your viewers that in 2002, George W. Bush virtually declared war on North Korea, which he somehow blamed for 9/11. But North Korea was one of the 3 countries comprising the so-called axis of evil, and the U.S. Invaded one of those countries, has been sword rattling at the other ever since, and so North Korea had grave concerns regarding its own security. So Kim Jong-un figured his only protection lay in a nuclear weapon, which he has built, and
Daniel,
he apparently has.
Let me jump in here. Hold that thought, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Korean Peninsula. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Korean Peninsula and the possibility of peace. Okay, let's go back to Daniel in New York. You were taking us down history lane. You were just talking about the axis of evil. But pick up from there. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, well, so in 2002, with his axis of evil speech, George W. Bush essentially declared war on North Korea, and that speech has never been rescinded in any way. There's been no apology issued, no taking back, etc. So Kim Jong-un figured, quite logically, that his only protection lay in having a nuclear weapon capable of striking the United States mainland, which he apparently has achieved. So that is his great chess piece, his ace in the hole. And I don't think, I will go on a limb here, but I really doubt that he will agree to full denuclearization unless the U.S. meets him, is willing to engage equally in an equally grand gesture, which Trump might be willing to do, but I can guarantee the rest of the foreign policy establishment, or blob, as you call them, will not. They will raise holy hell, and they will essentially block Trump from doing that.
Surup in Washington, go reflect upon that, because that's been my inkling from all along. I'm like John said, I'm perfectly willing to give Donald Trump credit for this if this is kicked it off. Okay, fine. Okay, but there are forces, and you see it all the time, and the corporate media mimics their corporate owners. Okay, they're not keen on seeing peace breaking out, particularly if it means negotiations as equal. That's not in their DNA. They don't operate that way. Go ahead.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. First, let me back up a little bit out here and say that, yes, I totally agree with John that a huge amount of credit is also due to Donald Trump. Because let us remember, before he talked about fire and fury and destroying North Korea, he also probably went further than any U.S. president had talked about, and talked about some assurances. He doesn't seek the collapse of the North Korean regime. He doesn't seek regime change. He doesn't want to have an invasion over the 30th parallel, etc., etc. So he has tried. He had made a lot of assurances also in his early months, and he has not got adequate credit for that. So yes, I mean, in other ways also Donald Trump deserves credit, and that's perfectly fine. You know, the one really good thing going for Donald Trump is that the U.S. system provides on foreign policy, huge amount of power, not just to the presidency, but to the president. And so he can really override his stuff, because frankly, this is all going to come down to Donald Trump and making that deal with Kim Jong-un, which the foreign policy establishment has not been willing to contemplate. And part of the reason it's not been willing to contemplate, it's easy to say that, oh, the Kim regime forever, the Kims from their part are always cheating, etc., etc., which is not entirely true. It is partly true, not entirely true, but just too many forces, I think, people in Washington are vested in a Cold War mindset, confrontational attitude to Northeast Asian geopolitics, with the 38th parallel being that tripwire, and it's not easy for many of them to come to terms that, you know what, the peninsula could be just insulated from that whole geopolitical environment.
Well, let's ask John, because John, that was his line of business for a while. I mean, what are the forces moving against this here? Beyond, because it's just Donald Trump's idea, but I mean, talk through the bureaucratic inertia that, that would be against this. Go ahead.
Well, I think I would disagree. I think that currently the top leadership of the U.S. Defense Department is not against what Trump is trying to do. And we just saw that in Syria. We saw that DOD weighed in, and so we had symbolic strikes against Syria rather than the more far-reaching operation that some were advocating. So I think that we have to be a little bit careful here. Now, I would take this back even a little bit before the Axis of Evil speech. People forget that nuclear weapons were first deployed on the Korean Peninsula during the Eisenhower administration. And we had at one time 950 tactical nuclear weapons in Korea. This is now a decline. Well, we had 7,000 in Western Europe. Anyway, President Bush the elder, who's now ill in the hospital, was the one who decided to put an end to this kind of madness, and so we began withdrawing them. But you don't have to explain the nuclear issue in terms of the evil nature of the North Korean regime, although perhaps there's some of that can be part of the explanation. It's really an action-reaction sequence, and we took the initial action, and the North Koreans then responded to it. So I think the same dynamic can be used in the current circumstances in terms of confidence-building measures, and hopefully we can walk this back. I agree completely that having a progressive president in Seoul is a huge help. Yeah. And I think China and Russia can also help. But I think it's going to be really difficult to unravel this knot, which we've tied ourselves up in on the peninsula, and these various asymmetries. Okay,
Daniel, this kind of leads to where I want to go in the program. I mean, I'm sure that there's a sense that if the U.S. and there's the perception of the U.S. backing down, the perception of the U.S. Involved in a diplomatic process that would be deemed as appeasement here, that would have a ricochet effect through all of the other entangling alliances the U.S. has in the Pacific. Is this part of the thinking there? Because, as John said, to untie this knot here, there's a huge ripple effect through the entire region. Go ahead, Daniel.
That's totally true, totally true. And there'll be a huge ripple effect in Washington as well, where all these countries have their interests, they have their ties, they have their, their alliances. Japan most particularly,
Yep.
But Russia and China as well. So if you know, and the North may be playing a kind of a Vietnamese game where they're trying to seek a closer alliance with the South in order to protect themselves against China. So therefore, that's certainly possible, and China could be getting nervous as well. And China has friends in Washington too.
And the Japanese wouldn't be very happy with a unified, strong, powerful Korean peninsula. And so, their whole defense thinking would have to be rethought. Keep going, Daniel.
And Japan has tons of friends in Washington also. So I think that you're going to see a huge ripple effect from the Northeast Asia, onto Washington D.C. as all sides sort of pile on, and Trump is on one hand, Trump has got great power as a U.S. president, but on the other hand, politically he's very weak.
Yep.
He is really on the ropes. He's taking a ferocious pummeling. So I don't know. I doubt very much that he'll be able to withstand these forces, and I think that he will. I'm pretty sure he is incapable of engaging in the same kind of grand gesture that Kim Jong-un is willing to engage in.
Yeah, well, let me go back to he won the presidency. He surprises us all the time. Maybe it'll work this time. I don't know. Don't you think also it's just a mindset? North Korea is this cartoonish evil character, the axis of evil. It's so convenient. And there's so many people that have made entire careers out of demonizing. And I'm not siding with the North Koreans or its leadership. I don't do that kind of thing. I'm basically a realist when it comes to foreign policy. But don't you think that's part of the problem here? Is just changing minds, taking a fresh look, and there's this really an amazing opportunity that we may never see again. Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. This is as good an opportunity since the end of the Korean War since the end of the Korean War to have a peace regime on the peninsula, as well as since the denuclearization declaration and agreements of the early 1990s to do denuclearization. Let me go out a little bit on a limb out here and make 2 points. With regard to denuclearization, most people, and I totally agree, understand their views that, this is going to be very difficult, close to impossible. He's not going to give it up. I'm one of those few, very tiny minority who believes that this is very doable and he can give it up because Kim Jong-un is not in the same position as Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi.
But
think about it.
That's why he developed it in the first place, to trade it away for security guarantees. It seems logical to me.
Exactly, and exactly. Let me explain that point also. What is a nuclear weapon? The purpose of a nuclear weapon is to cause unacceptable damage to the adversary. He already can do unacceptable damage to the adversary by trashing Seoul with his conventional guns, and therefore a nuclear weapon over and above that is something that he can leverage and he can bargain, and which is exactly what he is doing. And therefore, I would say that this is doable. This is a great opportunity. But what we have to do also is this cannot be a process which gets strung out over many years and a decade, and it's action for action with 500 steps, which then breaks down after 20 steps. This has to be a big, grand bargain done in a truncated way in a defined time period, and I think it's doable.
Let me go to John. John, you're on the negotiating team for the United States. What would you tell your boss, Donald Trump, to do in 40 seconds? Go ahead.
Hey, what I would tell him to do is just have good vibes in the meeting. Apparently, that was the case when Pompeo went there. I think what's different this time around is that the negotiations are not being run through a bureaucratic process. And a lot of people are criticizing Trump on this score. It's a crisis situation. People forget what we were talking about last fall. We were talking about the imminent prospect of war on the peninsula. So I think things are moving in a good direction. I am concerned about the asymmetries. Also, we're going to have one possible dropout in this process. Prime Minister Abe is in deep political trouble. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to survive or not. But Yeah, I think we just have to hope that the Inter-Korean summit goes well.
Okay.
And that, in a way, Moon is playing the advance man.
Gentlemen,
Trump.
we've run out of time, and very rarely do we end on a positive note. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.